In this video, we will do some revision of the work that we already did in class. We will be looking at some decision structures, also be looking at loops and files, and then try to incorporate some methods while we're doing that. So if you want to follow, I just made a new application. Go to Java application, next, and give it a name, and then just click on finish. So the name that I've given this specific application is methods revision. So make sure that you've got something like that. So what I want to do today is I want to use some methods, or basically just ask the user for some input, basically asking the user to give us two file names, and then those two file names we're going to use in order to read from the one file and to write back to the other file. So I'm going to start off by asking the user a few questions here. So before we do that, we need to have some import statements. So we're going to say import javax.swing.star, or you can just use .jOptionPane. So it's up to you, either the .star or the .jOptionPane. And then we're going to also say import java.util.star, which we're going to use for the scanner class. Also, you could just have said java.util.scanner. And then the last one we're going to use there will be java.input-output.star. So we want all of the classes in the IO library. So that's basically jOptionPane to ask the user some questions or to display something to the user. This is for the scanner class so that we can read from the file, and then IO will be for every other input-output, like the file class as well as your print writer classes. All of those will be part of IO. Okay, so let's start this application. So we're going to ask the user the name of the file that we want to read from. So I'm just going to call it string name of read file equals jOptionPane dot show input dialog, and then in brackets we ask the question. So we're going to ask something like, please enter the name. I'm going to go to the new line, the name of the file to read from. And then we're going to also ask him a second question, and that will basically be the name of the write file that we want to write to. So we're going to ask again jOptionPane dot show input dialog, and then in brackets what we want to ask. So in this case again we're going to ask, please enter the name of the file to write to. So we're asking the user two questions, and this is just using the normal jOptionPane, so it's going to pop up on the screen, so we can quickly run it and see what's going to happen. It basically just pops up this input. Please enter the name of the file to read from. So we're going to add something there. We're going to say OK, and it's going to ask us, please enter the name of the file we want to write to. And then when you click on OK, that specific value is then saved. I'm just going to cancel the run there. That's going to be saved in either name of write file or name of read file, or both of them is going to be saved. Okay, so the next part that we want to do now is to basically send these files to two methods. We need to read from the one file, and we need to write to the other file. So what I want to do in this specific application is we want to basically take whatever is in this first file, the file that we want to read from, make it all uppercase and pass it to, or create a new file called this, whatever the user types there, and save it all capital letters. So we're going to use a method for that. So this one will be a value returning method. So I'm going to declare it as public static. I'm going to return a string from this method, and I'm going to call the method convert to uppercase or convert to upper or whatever. And in this case, I'm going to accept the file name that I want to convert, or the name of the file that I want to convert. Okay, so now it's going to give you an error there until you have a return value. So I'm just going to say return null for now, and then we can change it later on. Okay, so this method, we're going to read from a file. So remember, when you're reading from a file or writing to a file, there should be a throws IO exception at the top. Or later on, you can also use the try catch blocks in order to make sure that you're catching all the exceptions. So in this case, the method is publicly accessible. It's static, which means that this method belongs to the class. We're going to return a string. In this case, we're just returning nothing, the special value null, and the name of this method is convert to upper. The parameter list, only one parameter, and that will be a file name that will be passed through, and that will actually be that name of read file that we're going to pass through. So how do we call a method like this? So we're just going to say, now I'm going to say string converted equals convert to upper. That's calling the method. And then remember that this method receives a parameter, the file name, so we're going to send the argument through name of read file. And you can use control and spacebar again to get the rest, or to get all of the variables that starts with name, like I've typed it there. So this one will be the name of the read file that we're going to pass through. So now you'll see also it's going to give you an error because we have an unreported IO exception. So remember that when we are using files, the method itself should have throws IO exception, but every method that calls this method must also have throws IO exception, which means that we also need to add it there. And then the error should be good, fine. There should not be any errors. Okay, so now we're sending through the file name to this method, and then we're going to return a string back that will be saved into converted. Now just also remember that if you're using methods, we need to do the documentation comment, so it's just a / and 2 stars, and it creates the comment for you. So we can just say that this method converts the content in a file to uppercase. Okay, and then the file name will be the name of the file to convert. And what are we going to return? We're going to return the converted string, and that's just an IO exception that will occur. You can also explain that IO exception on what could happen there or whatever if you like to. Okay, so that's just simple documentation comment that we did. And now let's get into this method. So we are passing that name of the file that the user typed there, the name of the read file. That's the file that we want to read from now. It's been passed to this method as file name. So now we want to do the following. I'm going to start off with a simple variable, string converted file. So we're going to change that one later on, just set it to basically nothing. And let's make a connection to that file. So we're going to say file equals new file, and then in brackets passing the file name. So this file name is the one that the user entered, so we're going to say file name. So this line just makes a connection to the file. We cannot use a file object now to read data, so for that we need the scanner class. So we're going to say scanner. I'm going to call this object input file equals new scanner, and then in brackets we're going to pass that file object. So now that file object that has been passed now gives us access. This file has got access to, or this file object has got access to the file, and the scanner class allows us to actually start reading from the file. But we could get into some trouble here, or some problem here if the file does not exist, the one that the user types. So we're going to test first if that file does exist. So before we go to the scanner class and start reading from it. So we're going to say if the file dot exists, so there's a method called exists, and we're going to test if it does not exist. If the file object, that connection to the file, if the file does not exist, we're going to do something, and the else will be if the file actually exists. So I'm just going to copy this part, or maybe just cut it from there. So I'm going to cut it, and I'm going to put it in the else part. So that's basically when If the file does not exist, we're just going to show a message. But if it exists, it will go to the else part, and then we can read from the file. Okay, so if the file does not exist, I'm going to use a JOption pane dot show message dialog in order to just quickly show a message to the user to say basically that this file does not exist. So the first argument, null. Second argument, remember the first argument is where you want to show this specific message dialog. If it's null, it will be in the middle of the screen. Okay, so the second argument is what you want to basically tell the user. So we're going to tell the user the file you typed does not exist. Okay, so we could do some loop or whatever to keep on asking the guy until it gets a file that actually exists, but we're not going to go into that now. And then if it does not exist, we need to return a value now. So we're just going to return a null there. So if the file does not exist, that string object will contain a null value. So if it goes into converted, it will basically be a null value that will be saved there. Okay, so the else part is where we actually start reading from the file. So we've already got the connection to the file, and if we get into this else, we know that the file does exist, so we can start reading from it. Scanner input file equals new scanner with that file object now opens up that file so that we can start reading from it. So then we use a while loop, accessing or using that input file object, that scanner object, and we're going to use the has next method, and that has next method will help us to see when we get to the end of the file. So basically it's going to read from the file in the while loop, and then you must remember to close your file. That's very important. Okay, so we've got the while loop. So this one is opening up the file, this one is closing the file. So inside of the while loop, this while loop will now, with the has next or the help with the help from the has next method, will actually help us to keep on reading from the file until there's nothing more to read. So what we want to do now is to get this converted, or to create this converted file, which is the one that we will return at the end. Okay, so we're going to say converted file equals converted file plus, or you could just have said converted file plus equals will give you the same thing. So we're going to start off with nothing, and then we're going to read something from the file. So in order to read something from the file, it's just going to be input file dot next, and we're going to read the whole line. So we're going to say input file dot next line. So that's reading. This part there is reading from a file. And this next line method is also the increment for this has next method. So every time we call next line, it increments the has next, or basically the pointer inside of the file, and it's going to keep on incrementing every time we're reading something from the file until it gets to the end of the file, and then the while loop will stop. Okay, so what we want to do is we want to read a line from the file, but remember that we also need to go to a new line every time we do that. So I'm just going to add a new line character there. So basically it will take the previous version of the file, add the line that we read from the file, and then move to the next line again. So when it runs again, it's just going to add a new line and a new line character again. Add a new line and the new line character. So it's going to keep on doing that. And at the end, when we're done, we close the file and we've got our converted file or our text there. But now remember that we want to convert that. So in order to return something, we're just going to say return that converted file dot to uppercase, which will convert that whole string to an uppercase, and that's the value that we will return. Okay, I'm just going to remove this return null there at the end. And let's just close down this empty space. Okay, so this is the method. So we're going to pass in the file name. We make a connection to the file. We check if the file exists or not. If it does not exist, we show a message and we return null. else we open up the file to read, run through this while loop, reading until there's nothing more to read. Next line is basically the increment there, and then we close the file after we've read every line to the file with a new line character, and then we return that specific text from the file but to uppercase. So now when we go to where we call the method, everything will be saved and converted as uppercase. So now what we can do is to create another method that will help us to print the second file. So we're going to create a method. In this case, it will just be a void method, a method that does not return anything. So we're going to say public static void, and this is going to be write to file. That's going to be the method, and we're going to accept the following in brackets. The parameters will be a string that will be the file name that we need to go and write to, and the second one will be the content. What do we want to write to the file? Okay, and because we're not returning anything, you see that it will not give us an error. So how do we call this method? So we will just basically go and say write to file, calling the method. What do we send through? The file name, and that's the second one that the user typed there. So we want to use that one as the file name. So that's the first argument there, name of the file, and then the content will be this converted content that we got from the previous method now. So it's just going to be converted, and then everything will be fine. So that's going to be the name of the file, and this is what we want to write to the file. And now this method is actually very easy. We're just going to say print writer, I'd like to call it output file, equals new print writer, and then in brackets you need to pass the file name. But remember, we passed the file name already through with the method. And now it will give you an error again because it's able to basically throw an exception, and we need to have that throws IO exception at the top of the method. And now remember, because we've got throw IO exception here, it means that we also need to have throws IO exception in the main where we call that method. So which is fine, we had it for the previous method as well. Okay, so this line is then opening up that file so that we can start writing to it. Okay, so now remember that the print writer object or the print writer class, actually, if the file does not exist, it's going to create the file, and if the file does exist, it will replace the file. Okay, so what we want to do now is to write to this file. We've already made a connection to that file. If the file does not exist, in our case, it will be created, and then this is what we want to write to the file. Okay, so how do we write to the file? We're just going to say output file dot print line, or print works the same as system.out.println or system.out.print. It's just printing to a file. And then what do we want to print? We want to print that content. Okay, and then we just need to close down the file. So we're going to say input file dot close. And that's basically the method. There's basically not anything else to this. So let's just tell something to the user. We're going to say JOption pane dot show message dialog. First argument null in the middle of the screen, second argument what you want to tell the user, and we're just going to say file successfully created. Okay, so that's basically it for this specific method. So let's just do the documentation comment. So /2 stars. Let's just define this method quickly. So we can just say that this method writes data to a specified file, and then the file name will be the name of the file to write to, and the content will be the content you want to write to the file. and then we've got the exception there. Okay. Okay, so we're basically done with this specific class. Remember then that because we return there, we can return a null for this method convert to upper. It means that this value could be null that we're sending through. So if you like, you can go and change that to first test here maybe before we send to this write to file, we can test if that value is null before we send it. But I'm not going to do that for this explanation. So I think what I wanted to do for this specific application I did already. So let's go and test this application quickly. So the first thing that we want to do is to go and create the file. So you're going to go to Files. I'm going to right click on my methods revision, and I'm just going to say new other, and if you go down there, let's go to other as well, and then just add an empty file there. Next, and let's call this file sample.txt, and we're going to say finish. And there you see your sample.txt. So this one is empty. I've got a sample.txt file there. You can just copy anything into this sample.txt. I'm just going to copy those few lines. So this is basically the text that we've got in this specific text file. So I'm going to save it. So there's my text file. You can see it's under my methods revision. There it is. And it's called simple.txt. So if I run it now, it asks me, please enter the file to read from, and now we call that one sample.txt. There we've got it. So I'm going to say OK, and then the name of the file to write to, let's just call it converted.txt. And now if I say OK, it says that the file has successfully been created. I've got a little spelling mistake there, and then you can see there's converted. So this is sample, everything lowercase or some uppercase, but basically lowercase. If I go and open up converted, you can see that everything is uppercase. So this application is working nicely. Let's just change that to successfully, just to change or to make sure that we are spelling it correct. So this is just a quick video on how we can do methods, as well as the J option pane again, as well as writing and reading from a file, if statements, while loop, and so forth. So this is a nice example to go through, so make sure that you understand this one.